Welcome to week 10, in which we look at communication in groups and teams. There is a lot of information this week, as you will very swiftly discover. But that's not surprising. There are shelves and shelves of books in the library just on this one topic. The chapters of my book, Embracing the New Era, look specifically at brainstorming groups and creative problem solving. One of the reasons that I focus on these two is that they are very obvious use of teams within an organizational environment. Nearly everybody in the organizational world has participated at some time in this kind of activity. So I think it's important to have a look at the success and the failure, the goods and the bads of brainstorming kinds of teams. In a more general sense, and very specifically oriented towards communication, is the chapter in Applied Organizational Communication. In the PowerPoint here, I try to tie some of this together, and I add another couple of views that exist in the literature, as it were. I'm looking at, I define groups and teams. I look at the requirements for teamwork, the types of groups and teams we might come across, and then move on to group and team dynamics, which of course is very much oriented towards communication. Firstly, a team is a coordinated group of people working together to achieve a specific common goal. And this is a little bit more formal than a group. A group can be a bunch of people getting in the truck and taking the boat down to the lake to do a little bit of water skiing. It can be your chess club, it can be your Harley club, it can be all sorts of different things, your family, your church, all the rest of it. Teams are brought together for a specific purpose or goal. Now that goal might change with time, but the point is that there is a very specific set of or singular things that team is brought together to achieve. So that's the main reason. So note though that a group is not always a team, whereas a team is always a group. So a team is really a subset of a group. And just think about the use of the word team that we have in the general course of conversation. I mean, you're typically talking about a football team or a soccer team or a baseball team, where that group of people, there is an implied coordination about their activities. In terms of groups, we have several different types of groups. We have what they call in the literature primary groups. And this really goes back to the very beginning of this class when I talked about the necessity that humans have to mingle with each other for a sense of connection. And that's really where primary groups come in. We might have a study group where we meet to learn new ideas. This, of course, universities are inherently a large set of study groups. Therapy groups, I mean, this could be a formal sort of psychotherapy group. It could be a bunch of folks meeting in the local coffee house.
It's pretty obvious here what we mean by recreational groups. Problem-solving groups, not necessarily limited to brainstorming, but quite often around that kind of thing where a team of people, hopefully chosen to have some degree of diversity and some degree of skills that are in a sense complementary. Hopefully there'll be somebody there that is actually running the event, that knows how to prevent one person doing all the talking, one or two people in the corner not saying anything, that kind of thing. Focus groups, not really, they're not designed to solve specific problems necessarily, but often just to expand a knowledge base. So if there's a particular issue, I mean, let's say sort of global warming, you might have a group of say scientists, you might have a group of sociologists, you might have a group of people who can all contribute different pieces of information to create really a bigger picture, a more complete story about the issue. Although teams may compete against each other, within a team it is cooperation that is required. And in a sporting environment, there may be occasions when you really do need to trust other members of the team to avoid personal injury, or at least to achieve the goals that you're setting yourself. And certainly in environments such as brainstorming, and a lot of environments that I'm sure you've all come across in your workplace, where it makes a big difference if you can trust the other members of the team or group with regard to their pulling their weight, but also not perhaps to make fun of you if you're standing up and saying, look, I think we should tackle it this way, and you come out with an idea which is a little bit unusual. The last thing you want is to be shot down or made fun of in some way. If you might have quite an oddball idea. This in fact has a lot of merit, but because of its unusualness, not everybody will be jumping on your bandwagon. So mutual understanding, mutual trust is really they're critical elements to the satisfactory operation of a team, but also effective interpersonal skills. So if you get into conflict, how is it we're going to manage this conflict? It might be a very sort of short-term issue. There might be someone who's a particularly snappy mood that day, and you're having a group meeting, and everybody is suddenly on edge because this person is jumping down everybody's throats. How do you effectively manage that? Well, of course, these are all critical parts of a communication process. I mean, sometimes it will be sometimes it will be verbal skills that you use, often associated with body language. There'll be certain sort of ways that you can communicate a certain empathy to that person. So empathic and intensive listening skills, we know from the rest of this course and from our own personal lives that this is really critical. It's particularly critical, I think, if you're in a leadership position. You may just maybe a leadership position with regard to a specific group or team, or it may be a leadership position in a larger context. But empathic and intensive listening skills, really, really critical. We all know there's a great deal of difference between somebody listening to us and somebody hearing us. So it's important, if you're in a leadership position, to be giving feedback to the person that's talking to you, to show that you're actually really understanding what they're saying. So this kind of goes back to grounding a little bit here. So if you take something that somebody said, you switch it around a little bit and say it back to them, that's a great way to show that you're being empathic, that you're listening, and that you've got grounding skills. So there is another aspect to the whole process, and I think we've all got experience with this too. In a group or team environment, it's important that people spend enough time to communicate what the plan is to achieve our goals. On the other hand, people can way overdo that, and you've got the message in 10 minutes, but you're still sitting there in an hour's time, so that's not very productive either. So, these are all parts of a communication kind of process. We need enough detail to feel comfortable getting on with the job. On the other hand, we don't really want somebody to go and give us so much detail that there's nothing left for our own, that we can make our own, add our own processes to it. So, this is sort of an interesting compromise between micromanaging and macromanaging, and it's all really intimately related to our communication skills. So great high-performing teams will be comprised of members who have specific skills and experience that they can bring to the solution of the problem or to achieving the goal. There's always a place for problem-solving ability. Ways where there's a little bit of a hurdle and we need an interesting solution to that problem. Openness, this kind of goes back to an earlier point about trust. If you're in a trusting environment, it's very much more easy to be open and transparent than if you really don't trust those around you to take what you say in its appropriate meaning. Support, of course, I mean, this is a critical part of achieving goals specifically by, if you like, novel means. Any kind of innovation is very quickly dampened if it's not okay to make a mistake. So, you know, we're all going to make mistakes if we step out on the wild side a little bit and use unusual techniques to achieve our goals. And supportiveness is a critical part of making that okay. Action-oriented. I spent a long time as a consultant in England with small businesses, and there's a very interesting phenomenon in England compared to the US. The US, you sit at a board meeting, you make some decisions, and then everybody gets up and gets on with it. You do the same thing in England, and they all go to lunch, and somehow or other, in a few days' time, the whole thing has kind of lost its impetus. So, you know, the ability to make a decision and then get on with it is obviously a critical part of achieving your goals, and that's intimately related to communication as well. I mean, if we have people who are kind of supportive, okay guys, let's get on with it, you know, let's go and put the plan into action, then there's a certain kind of energy and body language and everything else that will encourage people to do that. And that's also part of a positive personal style. All these attributes, by the way, if you really take them to their extreme and put them all together, especially the last one, good communication skills, you will also end up with many of the characteristics that are present in positive, competent leaders. So it's very common to find a good leader will have all these skills. There's not just for team members, but also those people leading them.
In the next few slides, I look at the issue of communication in groups and teams. There is clearly a difference between the two in the sense that communication with a team might be critical to the performance of that team because of the nature of the goals that it has and the importance of every team member to achieving those goals. This may not be necessarily true within a group. Clearly, your church and family will exist even if you fall out with somebody in that group. There may be stresses, the group may become smaller as a function of that, but it will still exist. But because of the nature of the goal-oriented nature of teams, communications really becomes critical to the performance. So over the next few slides, I look at this issue. And I start really by looking at the issue of characteristics of effective teams, the fact that you have common goals. With those common goals, you will have common role perception. One of the characteristics of an effective team also is longevity, in the sense that the team needs to exist for however long it takes to achieve the goals. There may be issues with regard to the size of the team. Some teams, if they're too small, just won't have the skill set or the diversity to achieve what they need to. On the other hand, large teams can become extremely cumbersome. There's going to be status within that team. Sometimes this is a sort of predefined role that the status issue has. Sometimes it is roles, status that group members take on because of their certain capabilities or skills, or because of a natural tendency to leadership. And in the course of the group life, there will be group norms that become established. These norms are a little different from rules. Rules are really prescribed. I mean, they're often written down. They're very clearly defined, or should be. Norms are the sort of unwritten rules that go along with all aspects of our lives, and will indeed go along with team development. And then the team itself is likely to have a leadership structure. Sometimes this is a lot flatter in terms of its structure than in the organization of which it is a part.
Obviously, anybody within a team has to have a role. It's not necessarily true of a group. Remember that a group really is just two or more people who share a characteristic or an interest or a goal. So a group technically can just be, all those people who are American. And so sometimes, having a very defined role in a group isn't terribly important. In a team, it generally is. If you are in a team, you're there, or should be really, for some specific purpose. You have a leadership skill, maybe you have accountancy skills, you're a plastics expert. It doesn't matter what it is, but it depends. If the team is going to achieve a specific goal, then they'll need to pull together very specific skills. And so everybody's role will be defined within that skill set. Of course, there will be some crossover. I mean, just because you happen to be an expert in a specific field doesn't necessarily mean that you can't contribute outside of that field. And the way that the team is structured really needs to allow for that, so that people outside of that specific area of expertise still have the ability to make a contribution. That can be very valuable. So the roles can be either task-oriented, bringing together the specific skill set that together will actually work with the way towards achieving the goal. There can be a social aspect to the kind of role involved. And then there will be the individual aspect. So in other words, if this really goes back to the individual contribution that you can make outside of your own task specialty. And according to the phase, the position on the timeline of achieving these goals, there may be changes in individual roles to play. So, for instance, there are certain skills that certain types of people have when it comes to creating ideas. I mean, some people are just, that's what their skill is in thinking of new ways of tackling it. Then other people will have skills at different areas of the problem-solving process or the development or the innovative process. So people's roles do change according to where we are on the timeline of achieving the goal. I don't want to go into this in any great detail because it's a huge field all on its own, the nature of team dynamics. I mean, there are many books that have been written on this, and there are businesses set up specifically to help companies develop teams. And so this is really a huge field. But just in this one slide, you can get some idea of the kinds of ways in which teams can be facilitated in a very positive way, and some of the things that can undermine team activity. So people on the positive side, team members, can tend to be facilitators. There can be the kinds of people who will coax everybody else on to give the team their best. Harmonizers, who are very good at pouring the oil on troubled waters. Record keepers, very important. Sometimes a few weeks on after a meeting, you're on meeting number 3, you're having them once a week, whatever, and people have really forgotten what went on in week number 1. So some degree of record keeping is pretty important, and reporting, because what goes on inside that team may have to be reported to others outside that team, other stakeholders, perhaps upper management. And teams will tend to have a leader, and this isn't necessarily somebody who is going to be a facilitator, but it's somebody that will have a slightly, maybe a kind of attitude where they step back a little bit. They can have a slightly broader view. They can perhaps notice when it might be time to rotate the group. We talked about groupthink and that kind of thing earlier in the class, and one of the ways to sort of avoid help avoid groupthink anyway is to rotate team membership. So the leader might be the kind of person who will say, okay, well, we're 4 weeks into it, so Ted, I'm going to have you out of the group for the next few weeks, and we're going to have a new member come in and take your place there. Now, you can't always do that with very specialized teams, but it's a very, very good idea to do that whenever you can. On the negative side, it's very easy for people to become isolated and feel ganged up on. Sometimes that's because they are being ganged up on, and sometimes it's just because they're paranoid. You, of course, have dominators, people who will jump in there and not let anybody finish a sentence, basically dominate conversations, and it's important for the facilitator to be able to kind of manage that and make sure that they don't really prevent other people from becoming isolated, for instance. Free riding is a problem in teams where basically somebody is quite happy to sit back because it seems as if everybody else is just getting on with it fine. So the trouble with that is that when you sit back, you really don't necessarily focus particularly well on what's going on within the team. You drift off and think about the shopping list or what you're doing at the weekend or whatever, because you don't feel you have to be fully engaged. The detractor. This is really can have a number of different forms. This can be the quasher, every little new idea that comes in. You imagine this sort of large cartoon foot which crushes it down. That's the detractor. Or somebody that just can be more subtle than that, and it could be every idea that comes up. It's always the negative aspect of it that comes out first. The digressor. This is a big time-wasting phenomenon, really, where you get sidetracked at every possible opportunity. So the end of a very frustrating hour or two or a morning, you realise that you have never actually sort of pushed ahead in the direction you want to go. It's been a rather more complicated kind of route that didn't really achieve its goal. The airhead is an interesting kind of role. I've been on brainstorming groups with somebody that might fit that category, and it's very difficult because in brainstorming, for instance, you really want every idea, no matter how bizarre it may seem. On the other hand, there are people who will, at any opportunity, they will really come out with ideas that are way off base and not sort of feasible. So, when you're having a formal brainstorming session, there's nothing much wrong with that. But when you're moving on to try and get things implemented, that can be very difficult to deal with. Socializers are another. They have a positive and negative aspect. It's very nice to have somebody that is really focusing on making everybody feel comfortable. On the other hand, if you've gone through the first hour and really all you've done is exchange information about how the family is and all the rest of it, then you're not necessarily any closer to achieving your goal. I don't want to dwell on team development for too long, except that insofar as it relates to communication. But these are the kinds of stages that teams typically go through, where you have a forming stage, which is will often involve networking. I mean, this will tend to be the stage where you recognize a need. We need to develop this. We need to change this. We have to keep up with the times in some way. And so this will be something within an organization where in a sense, it's problem solving, but it's a little bit broader than that in the sense that there might be a different way of approaching something, or it might be a merger and acquisition in a commercial environment, or it might be in the environment in which we work. It might be a way in which a different group of people within, say, a court system has to operate. So forming will often be, as I say, a networking process. There will be times when you'll be going to other departments perhaps and saying, you know, this is kind of what I think we should be doing. What do you think about it? And what kind of skills, you know, can your group bring to this? And then the forming will become a little bit more concrete. You'll actually perhaps be putting a team together to achieve this particular goal. When you go into the storming process, this is really, you know, this is your brainstorming bit. This is here's the team, this is who we are, and introduction, getting to know each other, different level of communication. This will be, you know, an ice-breaking kind of process and a self-discovery process. You know, within this first meeting or two, you'll find out who's really good at what, and who might be the natural leader and who might be the natural note taker and that kind of thing. And then the storming part of it really will be, okay, how are we going to approach achieving this particular goal? The norming is the establishment of rules within the team, the unwritten rules that form our social norms. So this will be, you know, how is it best that we're going to work together? You know, are we going to wait till the end of a presentation before we ask questions? Are we going to ask questions as we go along? You know, who's going to do what? Who's going to be the one who will say, you know, call me in a few days' time and say, have you done your bit? You know, the trivia. The performing, of course, is the getting on with it. And there may be some adjourning involved. There might be a time lag. You know, this is what we've now got the plan, and we have to write it all down, put a budget together, and then we might have to sit and wait while another group of people decides whether or not they're going to fund your particular achieving your particular goal by your particular means. So that's the sort of stages of the team development. And you'll notice in there that the people who were related to the forming, which might be one person, two people, it might be, you know, it's a little bit of a loose group at that point. And towards the end of that process, the group will be formed. I mean, it will be a more concrete group of people, but their roles will change from the storming to developing the way of working to the performing. Those people will have really be adopting different tasks, and this is often why people really love to be involved in this kind of work, because it means that you can bring different aspects of your personality to bear in the course of the process. So, as I mentioned in the previous slide, in the original bubble, you know, where this idea for a team activity occurs, there will be quite a bit of informal discussion and networking, and it will be a fluid kind of process. So some of this will also, in terms of communications, it will also be attempting to convince people that they want to be a part of this project. There may not be a lot of upfront reward for people involved in this, particularly if it's maybe some charitable activity or, you know, just something of that nature. But within all that, then you've got the initiator. There's generally sort of one person whose idea it is to do this thing. There'll be some people around them that encourage them. There aren't many of us who will be able to forge ahead when everybody's saying, nah, I don't think that's a very good idea. So encouragement will be there from some of the people around them. There'll be plenty of people happy to give their opinions as to whether this is the right way of doing it, whether it should be done at all, that kind of thing. And then amongst all that muddy water of different ideas and all the rest of it, there will be somebody, it may be the initiator, it may be other people, who are able to kind of sift it out and create some sort of structure that's a little bit clearer for everybody to understand. All of that involves clear communication, it involves listening, it involves paying attention, it involves grounding and all those things. And the clarifying, listening and summarizing is really where your germ of an idea starts getting ready to be put into a more formal kind of structure. And of course, during the maintenance roles, we're talking here about the sort of skills that might be involved. Tension relief. I mean, there will be times when there's quite a lot of tension between some group members, and that needs to be dealt with in some way. Of course, there are always compromises. You've got half a dozen people involved in this project. They're not all going to be happy to sort of sit back and see their ideas forgotten about while other people's ideas go to the front. So there'll be compromises, and of course there'll be gatekeepers. I mean, this might be people who have their hand on the purse, or it may be other groups who there might be certain even pieces of legislation which need to be addressed before your group can push ahead and do what it wants to do. All sorts of different things. And harmonizing is part of the social aspect of communication in the sense of kind of keeping the team together in a role that makes everybody feel comfortable. This slide is pretty straightforward. We need ground rules for the way that a team operates. Sometimes these have to be highly structured and written down, and sometimes they're just intuitive, really. And the norms, as I said before, that these are the unwritten kind of aspects of rules or standards that determine what's appropriate and inappropriate behavior in a group. And this all seems a bit trivial, except that if you're dealing with a multicultural team, these norms do perhaps have to be clarified a little bit, because they are the sorts of things that are really quite culturally dependent. I mean, I've currently live in a very rural and collectivist environment in Portugal. I've also lived and worked in Egypt and Greece, and it's quite interesting how social norms can change, and the way that social norms affect team dynamics is particularly interesting, because during the time that the team is conducting its work, there will be some considerable interpersonal stresses, and of course that's when social norms become particularly important. Status, an individual's importance, their prestige, their power position within the group, and this can change. A particular individual's skill set might take them to a position of power at some time during the team dynamic cycle, but that may not be their natural position during the whole process. There may be time when other individuals come to the forefront because the nature of the work that the team is doing will have changed. Just a few more definitions here. We're defining power as the ability to influence the behavior of others. And the types of power are legitimate power, in other words, the power that is exercised by somebody who's earned your respect. Referent power, if somebody has a particularly attractive kind of personality, then they will be able to wield certain types of influence. I'm not sure that I want to use the word power, in fact, all the time. I think influence is perhaps a slightly softer kind of term. Expert, once again, sometimes during the cycle of a team dynamic project, there will be times when expertise is particularly important. So, you know, at those times, the experts within the team will be the ones that influence the team's direction at that point. Reward. Sometimes people are able to influence others because of a reward process, particularly in sort of an organizational environment. There may be very real rewards for the success of a team project, and coerciveness. I mean, this is at the bottom of the list for a good reason, you know. But you definitely, I'm sure all of you have come across in your working lifetimes when somebody has attempted to influence you through the use of coercive behavior. The least satisfactory way of getting the job done.
I just wanted to introduce briefly the notion that there are different patterns of communication that can be established within a team and, of course, between teams. But specifically within a team, we can have all-channel networks of communication. We can have chain. We can have wheel. Now, when we're initially setting up a project, there might be quite frequent occasions when we all meet in the same room. So under those circumstances, we're looking, of course, at all-channel networks, or at least we hope we are, whereby anybody can chit-chat to anybody else, and the discussion does not have to go through a sort of formal route. However, that, of course, is only part of teamwork. There's another whole aspect of teamwork, which will not be conducted when you're physically with everybody else. So then that's when the communication issues begin to come to a head. For instance, if there's 5 of us working on a specific project, how do I communicate? Do I necessarily communicate all the time with everybody? Do I email and copy everybody? Well, if I'm doing a lot of communicating with person A or person 1, then do I copy to 2, 3, and 4 all the time? Well, if everybody does that, then yes, I might be in the picture, but I might also be getting 50 emails a day. So these are issues. There's no single answer, of course, under all circumstances, but one of the things that tends to emerge is that you end up with communication patterns where people team members 1 and 2 talk to each other a lot, so you get a sort of a splinter group forming there. Maybe 1 and 4 talk a lot, and 3 and 5, and so you get these heavily worked channels of communication between 2 or perhaps 3 individuals, and then you'll suddenly find that 1 or 2 of them are sort of a bit out of the loop, as it were. And that phrase, of course, has particular meaning, really, in a group situation like this. So it's important to establish the way that you're going to communicate within the group. The next few slides look at that pictorially. And one way to do it is that whenever you communicate, you copy the team leader. And that assumes that the team leader has the interest and the time to always look at everybody's emails. And the other way to do it is that you might decide what types of topic are very important and must be communicated with everybody, or at least the team leader. And then some aspects, sort of priority 1, 2, and 3, maybe priority 3 aspects, you can just be copying to the person that you think is a direct interest. So there's no right or wrong way to any of this. It depends on the project and the people and how often you see each other. If it's a small team working in the same physical environment, you might have a meeting every morning. In my experience, that's unusual, even though it may be ideal. But the kind of issues I'm talking about become particularly important when people are geographically dislocated, and they have to rely on email and telephone for most of their communication processes. Finally, I just wrap up this lengthy chapter by looking at some of the attributes of members of successful teams. Considering and accommodating multiple versions of reality is very important. It's almost a human truism that what we see we believe to be reality. And it's very difficult to really give equal credence to somebody else's view of reality. So it's very important to be able to try and make decisions that accommodate other people's view of what we consider reality. Inevitably, though, at some point, we need to hone things down to a single course of action. So the team really has to somehow take all their ideas and come up with one thing. And it's very seldom that that one solution will have been equally contributed to by everybody. So you have to deal with the notion that with 6 people in the team and one decision, there's the possibility of 5 bruised egos. And so the successful facilitator of a group, a leader of a group, and the group members themselves will emerge with a single course of action where everybody feels they own it, even though it wasn't their original idea, even though their original idea was subtly different to the end result, or dramatically different perhaps. It is important that team members feel that they own that final decision, that they don't have this resentment in the back of their minds that it wasn't their decision that was chosen, their course of action, their image. So it's a little bit difficult to deal with that sometimes. But that's the ideal circumstance. And one of the ways of doing that, of course, is once a single decision, once a single course of action is chosen, that then everybody, not just the originator of the idea, but everybody has the capacity to get in there and start building it themselves. So the person that came up with the original idea really, if they can possibly manage to do so, needs to stand back and say, okay, that happened to be my original idea, but that doesn't mean that everything gets built on it. It has to come from me. We have to accept the inevitability of differences, and I really stand by this notion that if you are going to get creative results out of this process, and maybe you don't always want that, but if you do, you're going to have diversity in the team, and that inevitably makes differences of viewpoints. That's the whole purpose of the process. So we have to then assume that differences, cultural differences, background differences, differences of life choices, they all lead to this diversity, and we need to celebrate that in a very real sense, and not just to accept inevitability of it in a sort of grudging way, but really build and enjoy those differences. We have to be committed to dialogue. It's very easy to be in a team where somebody's feelings get hurt and they don't say a thing for the next few weeks in team meetings, even though they might be talking about it outside of team meetings. So somehow or other, we have to have a process whereby we talk through these issues. And we have to pay attention to problem-solving procedures. In other words, when we are at the point where we're throwing out interesting and creative ideas, that it's not acceptable to quash those ideas. Well, I hope you enjoyed the week's readings and this PowerPoint. As I say, there's a lot in it. I would recommend that the PowerPoint, anyway, you go through twice before you do the readings, or perhaps once before, once afterwards. But keep it in the back of your mind when you do the readings, because I think some of the factors that come up here are not in the readings, but they are all quite critical to giving you an overall understanding of what it is that's going on here.